Imagine being 14 years old, too young to drive, too young to vote, too young to even be considered an adult. But in 1944, a 14-year-old boy in America was considered old enough to be executed. His name was George Stinney Jr. He would become the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. But here's the part that makes this story even more disturbing. 70 years later, a judge ruled that George Stinney never received a fair trial, meaning the boy who was executed might have been innocent all along. George Stinney lived in a small town called Alcolu, South Carolina. In the 1940s, Alcolu was a mill town, quiet and rural, but it was also deeply divided. A single railroad track ran through the town, and that track separated two different worlds. On one side lived the white residents. On the other side lived the black community, including George and his family. Segregation was the law of the land at the time, and the divide between the two communities was not just physical, it was social, it was legal, and sometimes it was deadly. George was just a boy. He lived with his parents, his brother, and his sisters in a small house near those railroad tracks. By all accounts, he was quiet, small for his age, and liked helping around the house. But in March of 1944, something happened that would change his life forever. On the afternoon of March 23, 1944, two young girls were riding their bicycles. Their names were Betty June Binnicker, who was 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, who was just 8. As they rode through town, they passed George and his younger sister. The girls stopped and asked them a simple question. They wanted to know where they could find flowers nearby. George told them he didn't know. The girls continued riding away, and that moment would become the last confirmed time they were ever seen alive. Hours later, when the girls didn't return home, panic spread through the town. Search parties were formed. People began combing the area looking for them. Then later that evening, the girls were found in a ditch. They had been brutally killed. The entire town was shocked, and within hours, authorities believed they had already found their suspect. Police quickly focused their attention on 14-year-old George Stinney. He was arrested the same day, but the circumstances of his interrogation would later raise serious questions. George was questioned alone. His parents were not allowed in the room. No lawyer was present, and after hours of questioning, police claimed that George confessed to the murders. But there was a problem. There was no written confession. There was no recording, and there were no witnesses who heard him confess. It was simply the word of the officers. Meanwhile, the tension in town was rising. George's family began receiving threats. Fearing for their lives, they fled Alcolu, leaving George behind, a 14-year-old boy, alone in jail. George's trial began just weeks later, but calling it a trial may be generous. His lawyer, a court-appointed attorney named Charles Plowden, called no witnesses. He did very little cross-examination and presented almost no defense. The courtroom itself was also deeply unequal. The jury was all white. George's family was not even present, and the entire trial lasted just 2 hours. After the arguments ended, the jury left the room to deliberate. 10 minutes later, they returned. The verdict was guilty. And just like that, a 14-year-old boy was sentenced to death. George Stinney was taken to the state penitentiary to await execution. He spent weeks alone in a cell, separated from his family, knowing exactly what was coming. On June 16, 1944, the execution was scheduled. George was led into the execution chamber, but there was another disturbing detail. The electric chair had been built for full-grown adults. George weighed only about 95 pounds. He was so small that prison officials had to place a Bible beneath him so the straps could hold him in place. Witnesses later said the execution was deeply unsettling. The mask placed over George's face did not fit properly. When the electricity was turned on, it reportedly slipped off. George Stinney Jr. died that day, just 14 years old. For decades, the case faded into history, but some people never stopped questioning it. There was no physical evidence linking George to the crime, no documented confession, and serious concerns about the fairness of the trial. Finally, 70 years later, the case returned to court. In 2014, a South Carolina judge reviewed the evidence, and the decision was historic. The court ruled that George Stinney did not receive a fair trial. His constitutional rights had been violated. The conviction was overturned. George Stinney's name was cleared, but the justice came 70 decades too late. A 14-year-old boy was executed, a trial that lasted 2 hours, a jury that deliberated 10 minutes, and a justice system that took 70 years to admit its mistake. The story of George Stinney remains one of the most disturbing examples of injustice in American history, and it raises a haunting question. How many other stories like this were never corrected? Don't forget to subscribe to Behind the Crime Stories 1 for more interesting videos like this. Thanks for watching.